Be going over today are the developmental norms and milestones. And we're also going to be talking about communication strategies and challenges as our students um, grow in their mental health and their identities. And you're going to hear that a lot today. So let's go through and talk about this theory called the storm and stress. And this has certainly affected a lot of what how we think about our teenagers. This idea that our teenagers are going to be difficult, basically, right? So Stuart Hall or Stanley Hall came up with this theory back in the day and talking about how teenagers are coping with the transition from childhood to adulthood and how this is likely going to lead to conflicts with parents and authority figures. It's going to lead to mood disruptions and risk behaviors. And while this is certainly true, it doesn't mean teenagers are always stormy and stressed. Research recently has found that there are a fair amount of teenagers that actually go through this transition fairly smoothly. And it's not like they're not going to have any hiccups, but it's not going to be as bad as sometimes we think it's going to be. And typically I find that it ebbs and flows, and that it's typically where they regress when they're about to make a really big forward step in their developmental progress and their brain development. And then they launch. And we certainly see that with toddlers and young ones, how they'll regress. And one of the images we talk about, or metaphors, is it's like pulling the arrow back so the arrow can shoot forward. So the storm and stress, yes, it is going to be stormy and stressful, but not always. So how do we begin to first start with thinking about how teens are actually pretty awesome, right? When we shift our thinking, and as a social worker, I'm from more of a strengths-based perspective. So when I approach clients, it's from recognizing their strengths and then what's getting in the way for them. And sometimes as parents, even I see this with my own clients, they get so focused on their students' behaviors that they start to lose sight of the bigger picture of this human being that they're raising, and that this relationship, this person, is much bigger than this one moment. Okay. And so how do we keep coming back to that? And when the kids were little, my kids, we had a system called the warm fuzzy jars. And for me, it was more instrumental for me and my attitude than for the kids. But we had these ball canning jars. They had two regular sized ones. I had a big one, and we filled it with these small pom-poms. And every time the kids did something helpful, either to each other or to me, whether I asked them or they initiated it on their own, they got to take a warm fuzzy out of my jar and put it in theirs. And then when all the pom-poms were used up, we divided it out, and I ended up putting like 20 cents per fuzzy. So they had enough money at the end to put up maybe $2 in savings, $2 for spending, and $2 for charity. And we would just, I'm not a very good one for doing charts. So this was really helpful for my personality style, where it ebbed and flowed. And whenever I felt like my attitude getting really agitated or negative, I would realize we had gotten away from doing the warm fuzzies. And so let's, who's been helpful lately? What are we doing? And the kids would get all excited. Well, I mean, as a 14 and a 19-year-old, that doesn't work anymore. And I've had to develop other strategies. So let's just review some of the things that make adolescents, teenagers pretty fantastic. It can be frustrating when they're challenging our rules, but also thinking about the skills they're trying to develop as critical thinkers and trying to understand the rules and the why, right? And that was a big thing as a Gen Xer for me. We are very critical of the rules, but couldn't always think of what to do instead. Where these more recent generations, they can be critical, but they're also very innovative and they're very connected in different ways. With the social media that they're in, they're trying to learn things in different ways. They're constantly being exposed, right? When you think about TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, all the different filters, they're very experimental. And this leads them to being creative and imaginative. Sometimes they seem a little bit more technologically savvy than they really are, or we'd assume, but albeit they are growing up in a much more complex world than I have. And even though sometimes I might be more technologically savvy, I have more street smarts, right? They are really aware of the whole landscape around them with media. And they haven't really been burdened by very much, right? So what they're able to bring into their day can feel very light. Sometimes it can be frustrating as a parent because we're having to listen to them talk about stuff that just feels petty sometimes or little, but to them, remembering to them it is big and new because they don't have that lived experience yet. So, how do we help them navigate these things? Because social media is going to have its positives. It's also going to have its negatives. Experimenting, right? Positives to that, negative side to that. So one recommendation I would make is if you are feeling like you're constantly, if you're in a rut and feeling like you're nagging and constantly having to remind them and it's just getting worse and worse, to maybe share that with them of, I don't really like how we've been interacting lately. I feel like it's all been negative and I don't want to be that way as a parent, but I really need you to respect the rules here or our expectations, but also internally to try to shift and see if they are actually doing things that are helpful around the household or being thoughtful. What are some of the strengths that maybe you can focus on as well? So let's talk about the teen brain. I was in a focus group recently with a bunch of mental health counselors, and it was convened by our women's grant. They were wanting to know from us as counselors what we're seeing affecting the women and girls in our community. And it was really interesting how the resounding gong with all of us was how much time we actually spend helping parents understand the teen brain. Because when we really understand that they're not adults yet and that the brain is actually still developing, it sometimes helps us to readjust our expectations. I get parents who are like, I am still having to prompt them, even as this 16, 17-year-old, this is unacceptable. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but with their brain development, you are probably going to be prompting them. And it dwindles over time, but there's lots of reasons that they might be a bit absent-minded. So even though the mass part of the brain is done developing, in the teenage years, it's doing more the fine-tuning. Those neural connections are really, really developing, mostly developing around their social experiences. This is what the brain in the teenage years is really, really interested in because it's connected the eyes to the hands and the feet to the most part. Those gross motor skills have been developed, even the fine motor skills. It's learned to read. It's learned to start absorbing information and learning information from content, right? So, but the social experiences, the content of their social experiences is what the brain is really trying to figure out. The rules of interaction, right? What's appropriate, what's not. So in higher education, we call this corrective experiences, right? Their corrective experiences are coming from the home first, and then they go to school or daycare. Corrective experiences are also coming from that setting, the teachers, their peers. Then as teenagers, they are getting a job. So now the corrective experience isn't just from school and athletics, it's coming from work and a supervisor, a boss, their coworkers, right? And then they're leaving the home and they might be getting corrective experiences from their roommates or their partners. And there's this set of cultural norms and social behaviors. And if you've ever traveled internationally, you'll realize how unique those rules are. The ones for the Midwest are very unique to the West Coast, the South, or the East Coast. Being in a rural area versus an urban area. And so there's a lot to learn there. So the brain, the teen brain is highly adaptable right now. And it's going to respond very differently to stress than we as an adult, hopefully, because there are still some adults who are not very well regulated. But teens are not going to be emotionally regulated just yet. They don't get enough sleep. And what we're realizing is it's because their circadian rhythm is a little bit different. It switches over as an adult, but typically they are going to be staying up much later. They're just not sleepy at all. And they are waking up later. Now, my kiddos, they were early risers. I'm an early riser. My son in middle school, there was days he was in bed by 8. He was just so exhausted and he could easily sleep 12 to 13 hours, but that's because he was having these massive growth spurts. I mean, you know, he grew 3 inches each year, 2 to 3 years in a row. So his exhaustion, I think, was mostly from the physical growth that he was having. And then he hit high school, and sometimes he would be up till 12 or 1. I'm finding now he's a freshman in college. Now he's kind of coming back and he's trying to get to bed more by 11. It's so he has enough rest for going to classes the next day. So it is interesting to watch that, how their circadian rhythm does switch. And it's challenging as a parent because we want to go to bed. And sometimes we're going to bed and they're still up and we have no idea. And I think we as parents have to decide how heavy-handed we're going to be with that, if they're going to learn from natural consequences and corrective experiences. So natural consequences of waking up late, maybe being rushed, not having enough time to get ready for school, and then having to deal with their teachers, right? So we can figure out, and some days are better than others. I think the parents who are night owls have it a little bit better with having teenagers. And for those of us like me who go to bed early, it can be challenging, especially on the weekends, following up their curfew. So the other thing about the teen brain is when we're going to see more mental illness budding, okay? Sometimes we get anxiety and depression early. You know, I see a lot of students who in middle school, even late elementary school, we're starting to see that anxiety and depression. But truthfully, I even have elementary school. My own kids, their anxiety came forward in elementary school. But typically, if it hasn't budded yet and it's going to bud, it's going to be in these high school years. And but we have to trust that their brains are resilient and they are going to learn how to navigate this and work through it. So when we talk about the brain, right, and when I talk about emotion regulation, I'm talking about an area near the brainstem, and there's a gland called the amygdala, and your optic nerves are wired directly to the amygdala. You have one amygdala in each hemisphere of the brain, and it first gets all the information from your eyesight and then the rest from the brainstem. Like, what are you sensing, hearing, feeling, touching, tasting? When I say sensing, I'm saying like your intuition. And so with the brain, a lot of times as adults, we have a fully matured brain. So we have full use of that frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that does all the rational thinking, the executive functioning. And this is the last part of the brain to mature around the age between like 22, 23, 24. So the amygdala is running the show very early on. It's the most primitive part of the brain. That's why they call it the reptilian part of the brain. And that amygdala is the threat detector. And I think of the threat detector being like a computer with coding it with ones and zeros, threat or not threat, threat or not threat. And when the amygdala picks it up as threat, either because it's a new threat or it previously coded the sensory experience of a trauma, a stressor as bad, as threat, we're going to get this intense response of adrenaline that's going to put us into fight, flight, or freeze. And so there's a parenting psychologist, Susan Stifelman, who I love, and she talks about this a lot. Like when kids get into this limbic response, when they get dysregulated and they've got all this adrenaline in their system, and then they're in that fight, flight, or freeze response, she talks about how we really have to first notice they're in that limbic response. And she calls it the DAB, D-A-B-B. So D being denial, that they did anything wrong, right? Or defensive. A is they get angry, and they might get angry at you, I hate you, or they get angry at themselves, I hate my life, I hate everybody, or they go into blaming other folks or bargaining, okay? And Susan says, when they're in this limbic state, we make a huge mistake as parents. We go into what she calls either lawyer mode, where we try debating with them and rationalizing, or we go into dictator mode, like, you are not, and we're laying down the law. And Susan recommends, and I have put this into practice, especially with my daughter, the last 5 or 6 years, that we suspend that reaction, because our kiddo is going to hear none of it, because they're irrational. The amygdala is not rational. The amygdala comes up with a stress narrative, which Brene Brown calls like the stormy first draft. She uses an expletive for the S word, but could say stormy first draft. And so they're talking about how are they going to get screwed over, right? They're not talking about, they're not thinking about how mom wants to help me right now or how dad wants to help me. So what can be really helpful when they're dysregulated is to validate what they're feeling. Okay, it might seem irrational to you because it is irrational, but to really validate it, normalize it for where they're at developmentally, that this is a big deal, okay? And help them or prompt them on what's going to be helpful for them to calm down. And then, and for us to recognize where are they in their DAB, and to really think of that DAB as a grief response. They are disappointed, they're hurt, right? They're going through some difficult emotions, and they don't quite have the shelving. They don't have the lived experience to know how to get through it or to reassure themselves that they'll get through it, right? And so how do we help them navigate that? And then once they've calmed down, talk about what are their options, help coach them through some of the problem solving that they're unable to do at that point. And then if there was misbehavior towards you, at the very end, address the misbehavior. And I typically, if they've engaged with me during the whole conversation, the consequence would be like a delayed gratification. I'm not going to be grounding them or taking things away, because I do want to reinforce that they calm down and engage in a conversation with me. But we can really add fuel to the fire when we come at them or we get triggered, right? When they're triggered. So that's the limbic brain. That's the teen brain. They're learning how to regulate their emotions. And they're also, like I mentioned earlier, trying to figure out what it means to be in relationship. And for us as parents, it's not just any relationship, but how to have healthy behaviors, right? So when we talk about healthy behaviors, this is something that we as parents want to really highlight for our kiddos. And when they're talking about stressful friendship interactions, whether it's in class, on social media, in athletics, right? We're validating and honoring their experience, but also helping to shape, right? Helping them to shape what it means to have mutual respect for each other, what it means to trust, right? Like whether they're experienced a betrayal of trust from a friend, or they might have betrayed the trust. For our those of us who have kids with ADHD who tend to be more impulsive, this might be difficult, right? Sometimes they can blurt out things and really violate their friend's trust. And so we have to help them navigate that. What it means to be honest. And it's painful as a parent as we watch our teen experiment with that with us when we've given them so much and we catch them in those white lies, fibs, or even big lies. And talking through, what does that do to the relationship when we lie, right? And what does honesty, what does transparency look like? And as parents, can we create a safe space for our kids to be open and transparent with us? If you look down this list, there's a couple of other things. Individuality is a huge one. You know, helping our students maintain their sense of self when they're experimenting and trying on all these different ways of being. And so we might see our kids, you know, go through several different shifts, whether it's the clothes they're wearing, their hairstyles, the makeup they're wearing. I remember my first reaction when my son came down with his nails painted, and I had to really regulate myself and not put on him, you know, my initial reaction to that, and how to create a space where they can explore and figure out how they want to present themselves in the world. Problem solving in relationships. It's not just problem solving with prioritizing schoolwork and sports and everything else. It's prioritizing and problem solving through friend conflicts. So there's lots of ways for us to be involved as a parent if we cultivate a relationship with our kids where we respect them and their choices and trust that they're going to get to a point of making good choices for themselves. I think the one that I focus on a lot with my kids is boundary setting, right? So what behaviors are you going to tolerate from a friend or a significant other? And what behaviors are not tolerable? And how do you cope with that without being super rigid? Because, right, all those kids are experimenting too. And so having those conversations with my kids of what are you doing trying to get in with that one person who's deciding who's in and who's out, right? And how do you cope with being on the out of the friend group? I don't know if any of you can relate to that, but we see a lot of that here. So moving on, when we're talking about healthy relationship, identity is huge with this, part of our kids' developmental phase. And how can we be supportive to them and help them to explore, I would say, while they're in the house, before they fly the coop. And I saw this certainly when I was a hall director and a counselor at several universities. The kids who weren't allowed to um, stretch their wings at home did so in very strong ways when they got to school. And I'm not sure that was always the best thing. So, and I'm not necessarily talking about drugs or alcohol. I'm just saying, how their self-expression. So how do we, right, create that space for our kids to develop their sense of self-expression and have those conversations about it when we are seeing them do something that might put them in a difficult situation. So like my daughter, when she was in 6th grade, was going to a basketball game, and what she was wearing, it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, I'm not sure that's the best choice for this event. And, and I tried talking through it with her, and she could not see my way of thinking. And so I had to put down some firm rules. Like, you're either showing legs or torso, right? It was when the crop tops were coming in, and she had very short shorts on and a crop top. And I just was not comfortable. I said, you're going to have to, no shorts, those need to go in the giveaway pile. You can find a different pair of shorts and wear a t-shirt or wear a crop top and pants. Now she's going to be a freshman in high school. That shifted a little bit, but I also come from a background of not wanting people to police women's bodies. And so walking that tightrope, I really lean on a lot of literature and parenting psychologists to try to navigate that. How do I keep her sense of autonomy intact while also, being discreet, how I would say, and be appropriate in different settings. So feel free to add any questions to the chat as they come up for you. I'm going to move into teen mental illness. And some of the most common mental health disorders we see affecting our teens in today's society, hands down, it's anxiety. And to be truthful, when we run our EAP reports to provide to the employers, the number one reason adults, children are seeking counseling is anxiety. So anxiety is not just unique to teens. This is something across the whole lifespan for different reasons. So the ways we typically see anxiety playing out with teens, you might see it more physical, like increased heart rate. They just feel very uneasy. You might see this especially with social anxiety, where they are just mortified to do anything in a social setting. They're very self-conscious. They assume everybody is looking at them and judging them. And even though it's really easy as a parent to say, nobody's looking at you, nobody's interested in what you're doing, really to recognize that as part of social anxiety and help them navigate it, or seek counseling so they can develop the skills and how to work through that. And you might see anxiety come up with testing, right? Any sort of performance. When they're in high school and they're having to get up in front of their class to give presentations and speeches, you're going to see some anxiety. As a parent, it's trying to differentiate between that healthy anxiety, right? Like, okay, yeah, you are going to be anxious, versus unhealthy. And something that came up in that focus group I was in was how much teenagers are pathologizing themselves and self-diagnosing watching TikTok. And so they're coming into counseling saying, but I do this and I do that, and this is bad, and that's really bad. And we're having to tell a lot of these teenagers, no, that's actually pretty normal to feel. Like your heart rate is going to be high when you are talking in front of people. Like until you get enough lived experience where maybe it gets easier for you. But for some people, it doesn't, right? So sometimes as a parent, it can be really helpful to normalize some of the anxiety so they don't see it all as unhealthy or pathological when they're ordering at a restaurant or going up to pay. If they're like, I can't, it's like, okay, let's take some deep breaths. This is an important skill for you to learn, and everybody has to work through this anxiety, right? And counseling comes into play if they still stay escalated, they cannot figure out how to get regulated in order to go up to the cashier, right? Or how to say something in public. They just, stay really crumpled up in a ball is what it feels like. So anxiety, healthy anxiety, unhealthy anxiety, and how do we help them navigate it? Depression is also really hard for parents to figure out with their teens. One, because they're in their room so much, okay? And two, because they're on their phones, and most of their social connection is on their phones, right? With Snapchat, texting, Instagram to some degree, and FaceTiming. So when we see our kid holed up in their room and kind of agitated with us, right? The eye rolls, it gets confusing. And I have a lot of parents saying, I don't know if they're depressed or not. So, and I think that's legitimate. What I would say is, right, you're shaping things. So when especially my daughter with her anxiety and ADHD, her dyslexia, she comes home exhausted, absolutely fatigued. And there's times where she just does not want to talk. And when I had to stop taking that personally and reacting to it, I had to learn to give her a break when she just was in that no talking mode. But we had rules of no eye rolling. Like there is ways she could be respectful and fatigued at the same time. But when they are sleeping in and not wanting to go to school, when they seem to be avoiding things, when you see a huge change in their appetite, like namely they're not eating as much, they feel like everybody hates them, and you might see their self-esteem really struggling. They might be experiencing some situational depression, right? And situational depression doesn't always mean it's clinical. Sometimes different situations they're in will trigger it, namely, feelings of rejection, either from a friend group or if they're starting to date, or they like someone and that someone doesn't reciprocate. So partly it's, keeping those lines of communication where they can come and talk to you, or you can say, I'm concerned. You don't seem like yourself lately. Is there anything you want to talk about? And see if you can get them to open up a bit. ADHD, the next category, is different from anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression can come and go. It can, be low grade and then flare up. Sometimes we just have situational anxiety or depression and it never turns into clinical. But ADHD or ADD, those are neurological. Those are there from the time of birth through the whole lifespan. And it affects about, 9-10% of teens. And sometimes it's undiagnosed, typically in girls, because they tend to be more the inattentive type where they're not creating disruptions in the classroom. And so, but, you might have a teen who's more hyperactive and impulsive. Now, all teens are going to be impulsive, but this is more, you see it even when they're younger. So ADHD is something that would need to be diagnosed by a psychologist, neuropsychologist, if you want accommodations for them in school. Typically, they're reevaluated later in school, the high school years, if they want accommodations in college. And then lastly, eating disorders. And, when we think about identity, this can be a big one. What our teens, boys and girls, what they are trying to fit into. And I don't mean just clothing size, but the identity they're trying to fit into. And this is where social media, TV, can be very influential, right? And we saw TV start influencing body image and eating disorders even in the 60s. So this is nothing new. So being aware of your students' eating habits, if you're noticing a tendency of binging or purging maybe, or restrictive eating, overeating, restrictive, those things, you most definitely want to get that evaluated by a counselor and address it sooner than later, especially for girls. If they stop menstruating because they've restricted their calories so much, it can have consequences for the health of their heart, their bone structure. And I just recently participated in a training for LGBT youth and the rates of eating disorders for trans students. For instance, female students who identify as male and trying to purposely stop their menstruation cycles and shrink their breasts. Gay men and the body dysmorphic images that are prolific in their community. Men who identify as women trying to restrict calories to have more of a feminine body and lose that muscle structure. So body image and identity and experimentation, our social behaviors, our society has tied all that into a tight knot. So you might see some of that and address it as soon as you see any concerning signs. So in general, some common mental health warning signs would be change in behavior. Change in behavior. So a loss of interest in activities, like they're isolating more, they have low energy, they just seem run down for a whole week. If it goes more than 2 weeks, most definitely have them see their doctor or get them in with a counselor. They're having difficulty with sleep or eating, their appetite. And you see them avoiding social situations like friends that they just adore and used to get really excited about, and they're still close, there isn't any conflict, and then they're making up excuses to not go. That would be concerning. If you actually see them harming themselves, right? Like you need to ask to see what's going on, whether it's their arms or their legs. You call EAP, we'll be happy to help you with that and assess. If you see them engaging in risky or destructive behavior, or, if they're talking about suicide. So sometimes parents find out that their kids are suicidal because a friend will reach out and say, hey, Ms. Maxwell, I'm concerned, or, I don't know what to do here. And then it's like, thank you for letting me know. You did a good job reaching out. I'll follow up. You did a good job. So if, anytime you're contacted by a friend or their parent, most definitely thank them, because it's nerve-wracking to reach out to the other parent and let them know. So teen risk-taking is something that we're going to see them do in lots of different ways, whether it's with substances, with the friend groups they're hanging out with, and where they're going, how they're spending their time. So some parents, I find it helpful having Life 360 and Find My Friends on my phone, letting them know they are accountable. I don't abuse it, especially with my 19-year-old. That's more so just so I'm making sure he's picking up his sister on time and to give me a sense of relief when I'm at work. But also it's a safety feature too, right? And for them to know that if something happens, we know where they are and how to help them. There are a couple of tactics that parents use that are really helpful. And the number one is using the X. So if your teen is in a difficult situation or a risky situation where they feel uncomfortable, where they can text you an X, and where no questions asked up front, it's just, where are you? I'll come and get you. Now, that certainly deserves a conversation either that night or the next day. But in that moment, for the teen to know they have a safe way to get out of the situation. I once worked with a nurse practitioner doing some teen education, and she had coached her daughters even before it got to an X situation. Like the friends were just making plans and they felt uncomfortable. She had developed some strategies with her daughters to kind of deflect, or redirect, I should say, to say, I don't know if I want to go to that party. I think I really feel more like a movie tonight. And so coaching our teens to bring up, if they're uncomfortable, they don't have to say, I'm uncomfortable, but just, I don't feel like it. Let's go to the movies. And it might be a way of the other friends who are starting to feel uncomfortable to give them a way out. Or let's go to my house and let's binge watch such and such, or, do some TikToks. So, but giving an out before you even get to that X situation. Substance abuse. We see alcohol is probably the number one substance that's abused. Tobacco and vape or e-cigs are certainly on the rise, along with prescription drugs, illicit drug use, marijuana. But in Wisconsin, it's actually 0.5% that are more likely to have used drugs in the last month than the average teen. So, which is high, but, looking at, if in general, we have a lot more students engaging in marijuana, in drinking, and to think about how we talk about these things around our students. What are we normalizing, especially when it comes to drinking patterns and marijuana use, as marijuana becomes more and more legal around the United States? What is healthy consumption, right? And how do we teach our students? How do we have those conversations early on and plant those seeds before they start actually ingesting it, right? And talking about the excessive alcohol abuse in Wisconsin, and what they're going to see is not quite normal around the rest of the country. And how do you know what your limits are? And when you start having those conversations young, when do you know you've had too much, right? And you might share your own personal experiences so that they're armed with that information when they find themselves in a situation where there are substances or they feel pressured to use, right? And without shaming them if they do end up using. What did they learn from it? How do they want to handle it next time? What do they wish they did differently? What did they see their friends doing? Did they see any friends handling it well or not well? Right? What is their line? What are things they'd feel comfortable experimenting with? What are like absolutely no's for them? Okay. And sometimes I do share with my kids, some of the things I saw happen at UWO with our students, right? Especially with prescription drugs, and how to handle that. If anybody tries to sell them drugs, what are some things they can say? And it doesn't even have to be direct, like, I don't want to use that. It's like, how do we coach our kids to uh, redirect themselves away from that situation of, I don't have any cash on me, man. I'm not interested, or yeah, not today. Or I, I'm really not going to be the best client of yours, right? And so there's sometimes some real creative, humorous ways our teens come up with setting that boundary and saying no. But because use is high and they're going to be more impulsive at these ages and experimenting, don't kid yourself that they're never going to use. And so I would recommend that you do more harm reduction than just abstinence training, right? And developing that self-awareness within them, and for them to know what their limits are, what their boundaries are. It can be very helpful. So in general, adults do drink more frequently than teens, but when teens drink, they tend to drink larger amounts. And so when my son saw this research, this actually made him decide not to drink at all. And because it does affect the cellular development of the teen brain, where adults, it's not so much affecting the growth of our brain. It certainly doesn't help us if we're over drinking, binge drinking, but it does affect the anatomy of the teen brain. And that can also be something very helpful for our teens to know, and let them know that the younger they are exposed to alcohol, the more likely they are going to be addicted as an adult, because the brain is getting used to having that chemical and likes it, right? And it's going to crave it. And so if we set those wheels in motion when they're 14, 15, 16, it is imprinting the brain. And so if teens can delay the onset of use, that is better for them biologically and for long-term outcomes. So lastly, we're going to talk about teen suicide and suicide risk. This is something I worked on extensively when I worked at UW Oshkosh. I oversaw a grant from SAMHSA to address suicide risk within teens and more college age. And what was interesting, when we would run a mental health survey, we had to stop implementing the questionnaire with our freshmen, because it asked, in the last 12 months, have you ever been suicidal, right? And it would go into what that actually meant. And it really skewed our data, because what we found during that time in the 2000s, that the majority of high schoolers do feel suicidal at different times in their high school years, even senior year. And then we find that those numbers decrease as they become young adults, because, and the theory is one, because they're learning to regulate their emotions, and they've had more corrective experiences, and they have more lived experiences. They've gone through the first breakups. They've gone through their first experiences with failure, which is what typically will trigger suicidal thinking. And so when I was at UWO, 100% of our suicide attempts were related to some sense of failure, namely the ending of a relationship. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for our for 15 to 24-year-olds, and it is reported very highly in high school. So when we're noticing suicide risk, basically it's going to start out with depression or anxiety that doesn't get dealt with early on in just mushrooms, or there's some crisis, namely that failure, that's going to make them think in terms of everything is helpless, nobody can help me, this is going to be my entire life. They don't really know what life can look like on the other side of the healing of the grief and the struggle. So being aware as a parent what they're going through in their relationships, or if they don't let you in, and there's plenty of us who have that experience, then we're observing their behaviors. Now, know that some of the higher risk factors for suicide are going to be if they do have untreated mental illness, if there is substance abuse, typically because substance abuse causes us to be more impulsive when we're under the influence, right? So we might do something we're not likely to do when we're sober. If a student has had multiple suicide attempts, we just don't want it to get to the point where they are learning how to end their life, right? And learning from the mistakes of previous attempts. Non-suicidal self-injury can be a risk factor, but I really want to differentiate that self-injury does not mean they're suicidal. It just means they're trying to cope with painful emotion in that moment, and they might not have any intention to die. However, sometimes teens can do self-injury that actually is life-threatening, and we have to be really aware of that in terms of cutting, especially. Firearms in the house are pretty much the number one risk for suicide because it is so fatal. So I really encourage those of you with firearms at home that regardless of it, whether anybody in the house is mentally ill or not, that you have those firearms locked away. Ammunition is kept somewhere else, locked in a different place, and those keys are in a third location. We know that the time it takes for someone to get the keys, go to the ammunition, get the ammunition, go to the firearm, unlock the firearm, and load it is enough time for this part of the brain, the rational part of the brain, to say, wait a minute, what am I doing? Right? Versus finding a loaded gun right away and in that pulsive moment. So do your due diligence with being responsible with your firearms. Lastly, if they've been exposed to a friend or family member's suicide, contagion is a real thing. And so to be checking in with your student if you know that they're very vulnerable from a mental health standpoint and struggling with grief of a classmate, and also bullying, exposure to violence, feeling really like an outsider, that can certainly trigger wishes to die or not wanting to live. If we can bring students in when they're feeling that way and teach them how to cope and shift some of those belief systems about themselves, it can go a long way. So it's one of the things that keeps me so passionate about counseling is working with folks who are suicidal, and working with them and getting them to a place where they see themselves in their life in much better terms and don't feel suicidal anymore. So social media can be a wonderful thing. It can also be an awful thing. And so teaching your teen how to shape their social media experience, giving them the media literacy of algorithms and how we can train the algorithms, and how to cope with that sense of FOMO when they see other people doing things that they're not doing, if they're feeling inadequate or isolated. It's just all so many reasons for us to have that relationship and communication with our kids, where they can talk openly with us, so we can share our own experiences as adults when we experience FOMO, looking at our own social media or feeling inadequate. And then what do we do with that, right? Do we hide certain people from our feed? Do we block certain things? Do we, like real positive things? So those are more likely to flood our feed than others. And then lastly, I want to get to how parents can help since we're running towards the end. So how parents can help. Understand what causes your teen distress. They're going to be worried about grades and school, problems in their relationships, romantic interests, juggling responsibilities, their self-confidence, hormone and physical changes, the way their bodies are drastically changing at a rapid momentum, the comparisons that they're doing, and even experiencing in the classroom and in athletics, and dealing with things at home, right? Family stress, conflicts, deaths, divorces, births even, and figuring out what to do with their future. So that's a lot swirling around. So the best thing we can do as parents, just to recap what I've mentioned already, is helping them develop their self-awareness, their emotional vocabulary, how they feel, how they reacted, how they can learn to regulate, notice when they're in that limbic state, that fight, flight, or freeze, and what helps them to go cool down in different situations, what motivates them, helping them develop those social skills. And most importantly, what we model to them. They're not going to take us seriously if we're dysregulated. They're not going to take us seriously if they see us constantly talking about how we hate our bodies or doing things like that. So they are taking their cues from us. And so it takes an enormous amount of self-control and self-regulation as a parent. And if we slip and we say something, because we can't always be on our P's and Q's all the time, to be transparent and address it with them and acknowledge it. Your teen will be much more understanding. So that wraps it up for today. I'm glad you all were able to join in. And if you have any other questions, feel free to ask us, contact us. You can reach us at the phone number 800-540-3758. You can email us. We have all our presentations recorded on our YouTube channel. And so if you go onto YouTube and type in Ascension, Wisconsin EAP, and you can also find a lot of our resources on our website. We are available for counseling, but we're also available for consultation if you're needing resources, anything like that. And we also provide urgent counseling on an as-need basis. And the best way to access that is to call.